right, welcome to jazz session number 22, making story models. Our last session, we're going to be talking about other models besides the two big areas we'd looked at, which was story modeling language for characters and goals and objects and places and so on, and fortune graphs and related graphs inspired by Kurt Vonnegut. Today, we are going to be looking at some other visual modeling techniques because you never know which tool you will need in the toolbox for a given story. But before that,
I'm the money.
Every penny of it.
as always, I should note that these classes are free. I am giving them to you as a gift, doing my part to pay it forward to the community, but I am certainly hoping that maybe I sell some books along the way as part of it. As Edith Keeler said in Star Trek, it's time to pay for the soup. For today's two books, we have, as usual, on the right, we have Making Story Models, the book that inspired these sessions, which is different tools for visualizing your story, including the ones we've been looking at, of course. On the left, we have a book, Today I Remember. It is a short story collection of tribute stories, stories that I wrote in memory of or tribute to some important person in my life, including the publishers of this, although they're not actually responsible for any of the stories, but they're responsible for the collection. Rebecca Mesta and Kevin J. Anderson of Wordfire Press are the publishers for this. So I thought it was an appropriate time to bring out this book because next week is going to be a tribute to Rebecca and Kevin. And I never do the paying for the soup on the tribute episodes because I want it to be about them, not about me. But I figured this is a good chance to point out that Kevin and Rebecca did me the great kindness of paying for this collection, or paying to publish this collection of stories in tribute to important people in my life. And I want to mention the contents so that anyone following along can know what they're getting here. So 11 stories that are tributes in one way or another. Today I Remember is a companion story for my novel Today I Am Carrie, and it involves the acrobat Luke, who we meet in that book, who has a tragic memory. This one, because it's set largely in a circus, is a tribute to my father, who was a lifelong circus fan, and Barry Longyear, who was also a lifelong circus fan. Those two gentlemen helped shape my love for the circus, so this story is for them. Il Gran Cavallo, and I'm sure I butchered the Italian, about Leonardo da Vinci trying to make a 24-foot bronze horse for the Duke of Milan and how things go comically wrong. This one is a tribute to Frederick Meyer, who commissioned artist Nina Akamu to actually finish the vision that Da Vinci started trying to build the horse. Hers is much better than the one in my story, but mine has a very, very amusing assistant who causes all sorts of trouble. Unrefined, which was my first Writers of the Future, not my first, my only Writers of the Future winner, about a person and a widow who are trying to save the founder's space station after his death. It's a tribute to Jerry Pournelle, who inspired the shape of the story. He didn't inspire the idea, but I wrote it the way I did because of essays he wrote. Father-daughter outing, a girl on the moon trying to rescue her father, tribute to my niece Virginia, and now her daughter Elise, because it's about girls exploring and going phenomenal places. Today I'm Paul, very, very common story today. It has been published, I've lost track now. I think it's been reprinted 15 times, including 8 languages. The android caretaker for an Alzheimer's patient who pretends to be her absent family. This, of course, tribute to my late mother-in-law. Scramble is a life-saving emergency crew at a crash site on the moon. Tribute to my friend Bill Emerson and the first responders in his family, who largely inspired the idea. Vampire's New Clothes is a story inspired by and therefore in tribute to Mike Resnick. He wrote a wonderful couple of books, and one of those was a vampire book. These were detective stories, humorous detective stories set in a sort of parallel New York. And he wrote a vampire story, and I found a great big gaping logic hole in the story. And I sent Mike an email saying, "Ha ha, how are you going to explain this?" And he said, "I don't know, you tell me." And he made me write the story to fill in his logic hole. So this one's for Papa Mike. View from a Hill is a story I wrote, sadly, the day I learned that Emeka Walter Dinjos had died way too young. He was a Writers of the Future winner from Nigeria. We lost him to diabetes, which, besides Walter being a person I considered a close friend and a mentee, he died from diabetes, and I suffer from diabetes. So it struck home to me that, wow, this really can take someone young. The Mother Anthony was my first Writers of the Future finalist, about a teacher with her students on an interstellar crash and how they survive. Inspired by a Jack McDevitt book called Echo, wonderful book, where I thought I knew how it was going to end, and I was entirely wrong. So I wrote my ending as its separate story. So this is a tribute to Jack. Bookmarked is about a dead man and his memories of what mattered most to him. I had the idea bouncing around in my head for a long time, but I couldn't find the story for it until the day that Dr. Philip Edward Calden passed away. Our Dr. Phil, we in the science fiction community called him. Our Dr. Phil was a frequent Writers of the Future entrant. He was a pretty good writer who was out there trying. But he was also an absolutely dedicated teacher at a local university. He was local to me, and somehow I only ever ran into him at conventions in distant cities. But he was so dedicated to his students that he only had the 3 months of the summer for his writing career. I think we'd have seen a lot more from him, but taking care of his students was what mattered most to him. And the last one last chore for Grandpa, is, surprisingly for me, as much as I hate zombie stories, it is a zombie story, a traditional Haitian voodoo zombie story about a young man going back to Haiti to rescue his grandfather from the Bokor. And it is a tribute to K.D. Wentworth, who prior to Dave, who was prior to Jody, she was the coordinating judge for Writers of the Future. And she was so dedicated to this contest that she was literally judging stories on her deathbed. And this was the last finalist she ever selected for Writers of the Future. So this is in tribute to KD. And I can't believe I got through that whole slide without breaking up. I'm going to count myself lucky there. So those are the stories you'll find in Today I Remember. That QR code there is not my traditional Amazon QR code. This is a QR code for the Wordfire Press site, Kevin and Rebecca's publishing company, because they get, and therefore I also get, a slightly better pay from buying directly from them. All right, so those of you who've been around here for this before are familiar with my mantra of tools, not rules. If anyone tells you that they have rules for how you have to write, they are either naive or they're trying to sell you something. If they're naive, smile and pat them on the head. If they're trying to sell you something, tell them no. There is only one rule for writing, which is you must write. Every other rule that anyone proposes is not a rule, but it might be a useful tool. Because as William Goldman told us, he was talking about screenwriting, but it applies to creative arts in general. Nobody knows anything. And by that he means not one person in the field knows for a certainty what's going to work. If they did, every movie would be a hit. Every book would be a bestseller, which is, of course, a meaningless concept. People have ideas they try, tools they apply, and sometimes they work and sometimes they miss. Every rule that someone can give you, I will find you a dozen examples of people who didn't follow it and succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. And I will find you dozens of thousands of examples, probably more, of people who diligently followed the rule and went nowhere. There are no you must rules. There are you could try this rules. But people often will teach or talk in the rule mode, including me, because I can be bombastic and I can be trying to make a point. So even if I tell you something's a rule, it's still a tool. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. All right. So what I want to talk about this week is the other modeling techniques in making story models. Ones which are not tied to pictures of objects and diagrams, ones that are completely separate, but are things you will easily run into out in the field, or some of them are a little more obscure, but I ran into them in my research. They are, again, things you try because they might help you out. And this one is the classic hero's journey. Now, I really should say it's a classic hero's journey, because as I do more research, I find many people draw this diagram slightly differently, with slightly different breaks between the sections. They generally break it into 4 quarters, but what goes into the 4 quarters differs from one person to another, because these are tools, not rules. This is the section, the sections that I came up with going back and reading Campbell's original work, but I will tell you that you will find others that have them, that it's an exact 12 steps made in 3 and 3 and 3 and 3. And I found that it was really broken into 4 steps in the finish and 8 steps in the start. I don't care. I want you to understand what the steps are, what the phases are. So we start out in 1, in the ordinary world. This is your character's life before something changes. This is a part of the story where you're establishing what normal is, what your character, what your protagonist will be leaving behind, giving up for 2, which is the call to adventure. 2 is where something important happens, something that could be shattering to the ordinary world, or maybe just to the protagonist's life. Something which maybe tempts them to say, I have always wanted to, but... So in The Hobbit, it is Gandalf and a bunch of dwarves showing up on Bilbo's doorstep and saying, hey, we need a burglar, come burgle for us. In Star Wars, it is Luke finding that, hey, this old guy that's been around forever is actually an ancient Jedi Knight and says that I need to help him get somewhere. What's that? Willow. The other big George Lucas film that used this, because Lucas was huge on the hero's journey. In Willow, it is Willow Hopgood saying, there's a baby here. She really needs to go back home. This is generally, if you're following Campbell, followed by a refusal of the call, because the ordinary world is comfortable. It's safe. You know your place in it. If somebody tells you you need to give this up, your immediate reaction is, no, I don't. Can't somebody else handle this? And typically that ends with, if you're following the structure, and remember, tool, not rule. If you're following the structure, encountering a mentor character, a mentor who is saying, hey, you have a destiny beyond this. You have things you can learn. You have things to contribute. It may also be a mentor who hits you upside the head with a stick and says, hey, Stop being full of yourself. Someone needs your help. And that ultimately leads to crossing the threshold. This is where you are leaving behind the ordinary world. You are going into that other place out there, outside of the comfort zone. In Lord of the Rings, Tolkien literally put the words into Sam's mouth, and they mostly got this right in the movie, where he's saying, if I take one more step, I'll be farther away from home than I have ever been before. And he takes the step, because we all know that Sam's the real hero of Lord of the Rings, right? If we want to discuss that and debate that, we can do that another time here. And once you've crossed the threshold, you're into the unfamiliar world. You're running into enemies and tests and challenges and new allies. Friends and allies you never knew you had because you wouldn't find them in the ordinary world. Going back to Tolkien, Frodo spent 50 years, they compress this in the movies, but 50 years in the Shire living his relatively safe life. He'd hear stories of Bilbo's adventures. He'd hear stories from Bilbo's friends who would come visit, but he was in his safe, comfortable, ordinary world. And he never knew, even with all these people telling him, he never knew just how much danger was just outside the bounds of the Shire and just how much protection they were getting that they didn't even know, that someone thought it was important that they have their peaceful life, including one person who was, in fact, descended from the line of ancient kings, a guy by the name of Aragorn. But when Frodo runs into him in Bree, we just call him Strider. He's just a ranger. It isn't until much, much, much later that we learn how Aragorn has been leading patrols to keep all the danger out of the Shire for decades. So that ally was always there, but Frodo was never going to meet him in his ordinary world because Aragorn and others were keeping it ordinary. From there, now you start the approach to the real danger. You have been tested, you have been challenged, you have been discovering what the dangers are like, and you're still continuing. That's the approach. Going back to Lord of the Rings, where at one point Frodo and Sam are talking, and Sam makes the observation that a lot of people have had stories like this, and they turned around and went home, and we never heard about them. Part of the approach is realizing that you're not going to turn around. You are going to keep going, because even though you've met these challenges, that call to adventure, the reason why you left, is more compelling than ever. And that leads you into a huge ordeal. And that ordeal kills you. Now, wait a minute. We're only halfway through and it's killing you? Well, killing you might be metaphorical. It is breaking that ordinary part of you. But it might be literal, because certainly we have stories that involve death and resurrection. But it is a death of the old self, that after this ordeal, you are reborn as someone who cannot be the ordinary person anymore. You must make a change to yourself, a fundamental change, that you are no longer the person who refused the call. You are the person who did what you've done because of the call. And so you get a reward. So you get knowledge, or in a very, very classical sense, you actually get rewards. You get treasures, you get weapons, you get knowledge and information. So that helps you on your road back, where you will become now in the road back. When you face the real final challenges, the final conflict, you will come out resurrected as a new personality entirely, which lets you return to your ordinary world renewed. But you really can't. You really, really can't. You can return, but you're not that person anymore. You've been through the rebirth. You've been through the resurrection. You are changed. You can never be that ordinary person again. Now, you may have a spiral hero's journey where you can't go back, but you can come back in a new role, in a new place. Going back to Willow, Willow Hopgood comes back a hero. And in fact, in his own small hedge mage way, he comes back a sorcerer in the village where he grew up. He is now in a different place. In Lord of the Rings, I know some people consider the whole scouring of the Shire to be, hey, we've been going now for 3 long books. Do we really need one more battle scene? Yes, we did. And this is why I wish Jackson had been able to put it into the films, because Sam and Merry and Pippin aren't the hobbits who left the Shire. Frodo isn't the hobbit who left the Shire. They are now counted among the kings and heroes of the world. And their ability to stand up and to inspire the people to fight back against the oppressors is the culmination of their hero's journey. Now, on the other hand, in the very end, Frodo just literally can't come back anymore. He's been through too much. He is too changed. He has to leave for the Western Lands. But Merry and Pippin and Sam are going to now be the story of the Shire in the Fourth Age. So this is the classic hero's journey. It's extremely popular, mentioned with George Lucas, of course. Also very popular with video games. Now, I say this as a non-gamer. I have played essentially 0 modern games. To my way of thinking, video games are things from the late and early 80s. So I don't know these games, but I know the concept that they're now very multi-path story oriented. And many, many, many of the studios that produce them take this and say, I don't care what Martin says. This is a rule. You will follow the hero's journey. You will follow exactly these beats. This is what your story will be. Which has in fact led to some interesting online memes. I saw a chart comparing like 4 different Blizzard games, beat for beat, how they are the exact same structure with just different character names and different opponent names. And people, when they see this, will say, well, of course, because it's just Campbell. That's what good storytelling is. And I got to tell you, the hero's journey is not without its critics. And that's because people treat it like a rule, not a tool. There is a wonderful critic of the hero's journey who gets harder and harder to find every year as the internet ages and leaves him behind. He is a film critic who is, if you believe him, because of course he's anonymous, so you can't, but if you believe him, he is a deep insider in the industry who critiques how it's done and critiques how it's taught, specifically anonymously, because he's going to say things he doesn't want coming back to him in his profession. So he posts, or posted, I don't think he has in like years, he posted under the name Film Critic Hulk. All capital letters, because the Incredible Hulk is always loud and always capital. He wrote some amazing, amazing essays on writing and the film industry and the game industry and the television industry. Amazing essays, all in all caps, which hurts the eyes. But if you get past that, he had brilliant insights, one of which was exactly the hero's journey and the people saying, well, of course these are all the same because they all follow this. And his argument was, first of all, Campbell never said everything follows the hero's journey. Campbell said, this is a recurring pattern that we see, and cited examples. And there are plenty of examples that do. But Campbell pulled this out from analysis of those stories. Tolkien didn't sit down with this wheel when he started writing. He just followed common patterns and ended up on this wheel. All of the examples, Beowulf, what was the other? Gilgamesh. They may have all followed this, but they didn't have this sitting in front of them. They were following a common cultural pattern, and patterns were made to be broken. So, the hero's journey is not a bad model for building your basic sort of ordinary person goes on a quest and comes back changed story, which is a perfectly good story. And film critic Hulk thought it was a great way to analyze stories to see if they fit the patterns and see if that was what made them strong, or in the case of the Blizzard games, he felt made many of them weak because they were too predictable. They were too cookie cutter. But this is the hero's journey. When you hear people talk about it, this is a common pattern for it. Come on. This is far less known today in Western culture. If somebody knows in the West, knows Kishu Tenketsu, I almost guarantee that they are a fan of anime, manga, Japanese animation. Almost guarantee. Because Kishu Tenketsu is the structure of Chinese, Korean, and Japanese narratives, of common Asian narratives, where the emphasis is not conflict, which is generally emphasis in Western storytelling. It is change. It is a character growth. And it's written well in the particular Wikipedia article that I linked there. Chat message here. Dawn Ray feels called out. Well, of course you do, because you are a person who knows this stuff well. So yes, you're called out. That Wikipedia article explains it well. The basic concept, and this diagram is my hand sketch of a common diagram you see in discussion of Kishu Tenketsu, is you have your key, which is your ordinary world that your character lives in, your protagonist. And at some point, an inflection point, you might call it, if you're looking at our diagrams from last week, your character decides to change. Your character decides they want something to be different in their lives. So it's not the same as the call to action, the inciting incident in a Western structure. This is usually a character grabbing their fortune in their hands and going somewhere to make it different. It's usually a literal traveling, but it might be an emotional, philosophical traveling, but it is going someplace. This is the show. This is where you are going into a new world and to a new self to become something different from what you were. That what you were, while there was nothing wrong with it, it was not what you felt you were supposed to be. So you go through the show, changing, right up to the 10, the twist, the complication. And it is important that the 10 be a result of the show. That because of where you have put yourself and what you have put yourself through, you encounter something you never would have before. Some change in the world that was probably always out there, but you didn't know about it because you weren't ready to know it until you went through the show. And that gets you to the 10, to the twist, the complication. Some big change in the story that is something you can only handle because you've been through the show. Because of who you were, the key, plus who you became, the show, you are now up to the challenge of the 10, leading to the Ketsu, the reconciliation. This is the new you. This is the you that is the result of the key and the show, the change, and the 10 that tested you, that told you what you had to learn, that you had to deal with. So this is, again, common picture of Kishu Tenketsu. It is, as I understand it, because I'm not a big anime fan, But as I understand it, this is the basic structure of probably 90% of Studio Ghibli anime and all of their others in the field. That this is how they try to structure a story. That you want something changed in your life, so you pursue it and you discover something you never knew was there that you have to deal with. And now you are a new person. And Dawn Ray is entering the waiting room again. So that's the Kisho Tenketsu. This is the Save the Cat beat sheet. And you'll hear a lot of writers talk about Save the Cat, how it's broken into your Act 1, your Act 2A and 2B, and your Act 3, and the different things that happen in there. And we kind of talked about this before in last week's where we were talking about, hey, why is it Act 2A and 2B? Why is it 3 acts and not 4? And I ask the same question. I get the same answer, which is, that's the way we've always done it. The beat sheet was not created by Blake Snyder. He did write the book, Save the Cat, and a sequel or two before he passed away, and others have taken up the brand. But it's much older than that. Snyder learned from other people who learned from other people. What Snyder did was he popularized and formalized it in a book that's easy for people to follow. And this is very popular in Hollywood, just like Hero's Journey is almost mandatory in video games. I won't say Save the Cat is mandatory in Hollywood, but there's generations of producers who grew up with this as the template for this is what a story is supposed to look like. It did originate with screenplays, in fact, as Snyder documented in the Save the Cat book. It has been adapted for novels because some of Snyder's advice is very specific to the feature film structure. So Save the Cat writes a novel is the same knowledge adapted for novel writing. And oh yeah, if the hero's journey is controversial, Save the Cat is really controversial. I guarantee you that at some point, as you talk about Save the Cat, you are going to meet some person who not just says, that's a tool. They say, no, that's not a tool. Don't do that. Never do that. The guy who wrote that, Blake Snyder never had a successful movie in his life. Why are you listening to him? You will absolutely run into people who are cat haters. But it's a tool. It's a tool, and it's a tool you would want to know about because you decide what tools to follow. You don't let people tell you rules of what you can and can't or must and must not do. It's a tool to study. The people who really, really hate it, many of them love indie art films and exploratory films and films that break the mold. They'll say this is all about formula. And I, being a tools not rules person, say they should make whatever film they want. But those indie art films are generally doing really well if they break a few $1 million. Films that successfully followed Save the Cat generally are making in the hundreds of millions on the high end. And it is a well-known formula. Now, does formula lead to formulaic? Yes. But formula also can sometimes lead to really good. Does not following a formula make you any more likely to be successful? I haven't seen the proof of it yet. But let's talk more about the beat sheet. First, I want to mention, you know what? Every one of these things breaks into 4s. You'll see, again, different versions of the hero's journey, but they all break into quadrants. And it's just a matter of which sections go into which quadrants. They all break into quadrants. And look at your Kisho Tenketsu. It breaks into quadrants. And look at your beat sheet broken into quadrants. They are different models conceptually, but they all seem to fall into this 3/4 act structure of here's what life was, here's what life's becoming, here's what life is. And the becoming includes a midpoint where things are changed from there. Is this some sort of a universal principle? Not necessarily. Film critic Hulk, when he discusses these structures, talks about how some stories have a whole lot more than 4 acts. If we go back to the definition of acts that we talked about early on, it is a point where you have an inflection point, where you've made a transition that you can't go back on. By that definition, first of all, not everybody agrees what the acts are. But second, you can find stories that are 7, 8, 10 acts that these are the places where you can't go back now. So 4 is clearly not universal, but it seems to have a commonality to it. So let's talk about what we saw back here. Go back to the picture. Talk about the structure of this picture a little more, where we have our acts 1, 2A, 2B, and 3. But it's also broken into columns: opening image, theme stated, catalyst, debate, B story, midpoint, all is lost, and so on and so on and so on. Snyder called these the beats. And he identified 15 specific beats that are the structure of a traditional Hollywood blockbuster. So we have these beats, and we have roughly the percentage point where they come in the book or in the screenplay or whatever. And here's where I feel like Snyder was veering past the point of tool into rule, because he said that he didn't do these in percentages. He did these in pages in a script, with assumption that a Hollywood film script is 110 pages most of the time. So he had breakdowns of where the pages are. And he said producers will literally turn to page 55 and say, where's the false victory or the false defeat here? We're at the exact middle of the story. There's supposed to be a false victory or false defeat here. There isn't, so your story is broken. Don't bring me broken stories. And they stop reading. They don't actually read. They turn to particular pages and look for particular turns in the story. Now, obviously not everybody's going to do that, but these are good guidelines from analyzing numerous stories. Opening image is your initial hook. This is what your ordinary world looks like. And it is, in screenwriting, of course, it's actually a very visual. This is some picture, some scene that says, here's where we are today. And that's generally the opening. So it's the 1% mark. Early on, and this is one that I have trouble with, even though I understand what he's getting at about 5%, he wants some character, usually not the protagonist, but some other character, to actually state the theme of the story out loud, what this story's about. Now, you, as the viewer, don't realize that's the theme yet because you haven't been through it. But he wants to make sure that this concept, your theme, what your story's about, is stated up front so people know about it. And this is all happening in the setup period, the 1 to 10% of your story. We're just telling what the normal world is about, right up until the catalyst comes around that threatens the normal world or breaks it or threatens the protagonist. Somehow sets up, this is sounding kind of like Campbell, setting up a call to adventure. And then we have a debate where the protagonist is basically finding reasons not to go. This is sounding like Campbell. There we have the refusal of the call. And then at roughly the 20% point, we break into 2. This is the crossing the threshold from Campbell. This is the protagonist saying, I'm going to have to deal with this. And then as we go into our Act 2, around the 22%, so early in Act 2, he wants to see a B story. Now, if you're writing a novel, this isn't a bad idea. In fact, a B, a C, a D you might have. If you're writing a short story, you probably don't have room for this. But the concept of the B story is, hey, there's more than one story going on here. And that B story is starting early in Act 2. That B story is something that complements the main story, that will help us learn things about the main story, but is its own separate sub-story, its own even potentially protagonist and everything. And the example, or one example he cites, is one that I know will make some people cringe. I think it's an amusing movie, Legally Blonde. And yes, if you're a lawyer, Legally Blonde is not accurate to the law at all. Well, grow up. Welcome to my world. No one is ever writing a real story of what being a programmer is like, because I got to tell you, we are boring people with boring jobs. You're going to concentrate on the exciting part. Most police officers will tell you that police shows, police movies have nothing to do with real police work. Doctors say that nothing to do with, except I'm hearing great things about Pitt, the new one, that I'm being told that's incredibly accurate. But just because Legally Blonde isn't much like real law school doesn't mean it doesn't have a spirit of law school to convey to people. In Legally Blonde, which I haven't watched in probably 15 years, but the main story is about Elle Wood going to law school basically to prove her unfaithful boyfriend that he's wrong, that she is capable of everything he is. And somewhere in Act 2, she ends up meeting a woman who's involved in a fitness studio, who is involved in a complicated court case, which Elle cannot legally represent her, of course, but this is fantasy. This is not reality. But Elle helps her with this. So it's a whole separate story about this woman and her legal battles and how Elle is helping her in this. And that legal process there is helping Elle to grow as a law student and eventually a lawyer. So your B story should stand on its own as a story, but it should also be teaching things or revealing things for the protagonist in the A story. Then he talks about how everything from 20 to 50% is what he calls the fun and games. And he calls it that not because it's fun, because let me tell you, if your movie is Die Hard and you are John McClane trying to survive in a building full of terrorists trying to kill you and you're trying to kill them first, there ain't no fun and games here. It's not fun and games for the characters, but it is for the audience. This is literally the part of the movie that they came here to see. If they watched the trailers and said, I got to go see that movie, it is full of spaceships blasting through the sky and shooting at each other and people bouncing through the air and having sword battles and everything, lightsaber battles. Or it is, if you are doing Die Hard, it is John McClane in machine gun battles and running through halls and leaping off buildings. The fun and games section is all the stuff that makes the genre exciting to the audience, leading right up to number 9, the midpoint. And Snyder talks about the midpoint being at the mid, 50%. Again, you don't have to be so literal. But the midpoint has one of two characteristics. It's a false victory or a false defeat. A false victory meaning, hey, we've captured a crook. We've solved the problem. This is all great. Heh, heh, heh. You haven't, but you think you have. This is what makes it an inflection point to some degree, because you've stopped all the chaos and frenetic activity of the fun and games because you think it's over and you're about to learn otherwise. Or it might be a false defeat. It might be that you think coming out of this that it's over, it can't get any worse. Well, buddy, it's about to get worse. Regardless, the next section, 50 to 75%, is bad guys close in. Now, it might not be literal bad guys. This is depending on your genre. It might be, if it's a disaster movie, this is where the building catches on fire and everything goes wrong or something like that. The bad guys close in section is where you discover that you only thought you knew what was going on when you hit that midpoint. Everything is getting worse leading up to the all is lost moment at the 75% point. This is where you now really, really cannot get any lower. But you have a chance to stop and think, okay, so am I going to give up then? and go back to Sam and Frodo in the woods, go back to Hero's Journey, this is the point where the story exists because you didn't give up. In the dark night of the soul, you looked at what was going on. You looked at the challenges and you said, I'm not done yet. I'm not lost yet. I am going to keep going, even though there's no hope. Which breaks us into 3. There's nothing left to lose. If there's no hope, if nothing can get any worse, then you might as well try. And in the finale, 80 to 100%, you surge to victory. Or if this is a tragedy story, you fail to surge for victory and everything fails and gets worse, and you end up stabbing your eyes out and wandering around as a blind man through your kingdom for the rest of your life, leading up to the final image, which should be a strong reflection, according to Snyder, of that opening image. That this is that ordinary world with you changed. God, this sounds a lot like Hero's Journey. It is a layout of particular beats within Hero's Journey. So those are 15 beats. So going back here, we see them laid out on this grid where things should be happening and where his suggested numbers are. Now let's look down here at the bottom, because in the book, he talks about calling these beats. So we have the beat from 80 to 100%, which he's calling the finale. But in the book, as you read deeper, he actually breaks it up into smaller sub-beats, which is really kind of not a bad layout for an action-adventure conclusion and climax. So we have, now that you've decided you're going to keep going, you gather the team. All right, you're going to need help. If you're going forward from here, you get the allies together and decide how you're going to proceed. You execute the plan. This is what we're going to do. A little more obscure example is, but I consider it my favorite Bruce Willis movie, even over Die Hard. It's the movie Hudson Hawk. And after everything has fallen apart and things can't get worse, but they just survive the apartment getting blown up. So Bruce Willis and Danny DeVito, Hudson and Eddie are, no, Eddie, Hudson is Eddie. Lost his name. But the team member, they're like, okay, we're going to take these explosive harpoons and we are going to storm the castle and rescue Anna. And we are going, Tommy, that was his name, Tommy. We are going to rescue her and get back all the pieces of the gold machine and stop them from destroying the world. And they execute the plan. And this is where they go through and they are singing side by side as they proceed through this. And they are just going through all the motions of carrying out their great plan right up to the high tower surprise. This is the moment where even the new plan falls apart. This is the moment in Hudson Hawk where Tommy goes off the cliff in the limousine and it blows up with him riding it down and crashing into the ravine. This is the point where Hudson runs into the CIA agent who is now going to stop him. And there's a big fight, and he's ready to say, okay, I defeat him, and he defeats him, and the butler shows up with a giant knife at Hudson's throat, and Hudson is lost. He's failed. That's the high tower surprise. That's where even the big new plan that you were sure was the right answer falls apart, and now you have to dig deep down. You have to execute essentially a plan on the fly. As a pantser, I'm all for plans on the fly. You execute this new plan to overcome these last-minute obstacles, the high tower surprise, leading into your victory and the final image. So those are how the beats lay out. But now we add scene cards. Now, here is where Snyder and his screenwriting approach come in specifically. Because Snyder says specifically, you get 44 scene cards. And you really only get 40, but he's giving you 4 to spare because maybe there are places where you just need a little extra, so you've got 4 to play with. But you have 10 scene cards that you lay out across these beats. And if you find one beat is really kind of full, that you've got too many cards there, then you need to look at that beat and say, what's going on here? Can I simplify it? If you've got beats which are sparse, nothing's happening, then you look and say, well, what should be happening here? So he's using this as an analysis tool, that you want to lay out these cards. And what's a card? The contents of a card are pretty simple. Where and when is this scene happening? Describe the scene in one line or so, and note two important things. How does our fortune change here, for better or for worse? Because I got to tell you, if you aren't seeing a change in fortune, why are we seeing this scene? Yes, you can have scenes that are simply about character change, but that itself is a form of fortune change. If it is a character learning that, wow, that person who you thought was absolutely an emotional wreck and couldn't take care of herself, so you have to, and suddenly she's the strong one after all you've been through, and she's the one patching up the bodies. And it's like, oh, she's not who I thought she was. She's a person I can rely on instead of her relying on me. That's still a change in fortune. And the other thing you put on is, what is the conflict in this scene? So as an example, aft airlock after the engine ejects. So this is bad. When your spaceship ejects the engine, you're generally in bad shape. So Ross and Alice are preparing to evacuate, but the airlock is damaged. They can't use it. So the fortune change is they can't escape. They ran to the airlock thinking this was their way out of the endangered ship, and they can't. And we have two conflicts happening in this scene. Alice fighting with the computer and Ross with the lock. So Ross is trying to get the lock to open while Alice is checking the computer and saying, how else could we get out of here? And the computer is busy dealing with the fact that the ship is falling apart and ready to blow up, so the computer doesn't want to pay attention to her. So those are the two conflicts in this scene. So you put those on each scene card. And obviously, if you're going to really do this, you need a bigger screen than you probably fit on here, or you need to expand and collapse cards. But you put these on here. Or if you are Hollywood especially, but if you're a visual thinker in general, your scene cards might just be a picture. Or maybe both. Maybe you have the picture on one side because you're essentially doing a storyboard, and on the other side you have the description of what's going on in that scene. So this is what you use this for, is rearranging until you get a balance. And again, this is a screenwriting approach. Doesn't have to be the same for a novel or a short story. But in his screenwriting approach, he basically said you want 10 scenes per act or half act. And that adds up to 40. But he was giving you 44, so you have some room to play with your favorite bits. So that is the structure recommended for a screenplay. But if you are looking at a short story, you don't have 40 scenes in a short story. I'm sorry, that is not a short story. That is at least a novella, might be a novel, but if it's a really big novel, it might be more than 40. So you'll find your own balance. Don't let Snyder tell you the exact right number, but the concept of the screen card is not a bad way to discuss your scenes. Dawn Ray is joining us again. I feel bad for Dawn Ray. Must be computer problems going on. So the concept that you say, what's happening in this scene? What did it change? And what conflict were we dealing with here? Is a nice way of summarizing a scene out at this outline level. Amen. Now, my next picture is my personal addition to the beat sheet concept. I call it the graduated beat sheet. And this should look awfully familiar after we talked about fortune graphs last week, because this is essentially laying a fortune graph out on a beat sheet. So every act is broken up from triumph to success to up. So it's not winning, but up is good, to ordinary to down. It's not bad, but it's not ordinary. To failure. Things are going bad. To tragedy. Things are going as bad as they can get. And now, when you put your scene cards on, you put them at different levels within those gradations. And you are essentially using them to map out a fortune graph. How things are getting better, and then they're getting worse, and then they're getting better, and then they're getting worse, and then they're getting seem like really good, and then they start going really downhill, and then you try to climb out, and you get to executing the plan, and the high tower surprises where you drop all the way down to, oh no, we thought we had it, and we're failing. So this is, for me, a really nice intersection between the fortune graphs we looked at as a way of thinking about how things are changing with the story and the beat sheet of actual scenes within the story. I have to tell you, unless you have a really big wall and post-it notes or some really flexible software, it is hard to draw this picture. I have done it with tools that I have, but it's really hard to put it all on one page or on one screen. It is really hard. By the time you zoom out to the point where you can see the fortune graph, it's forest and trees. You can't see the details. But, you know, no tool is perfect. No method is perfect. It still is a good way of visualizing how things are getting worse and worse and worse, and we're starting to get better, and things are getting worse, and we start to get better and better and better, and oh, high tower size, and we're climbing up. So that's our graduated beat sheet. Our next model is called the collider model. And I have to say, I've only seen this documented one place. I'm sure it's documented others. I just don't find it. And that's my book. But I didn't come up with this. This was described in an interview I heard or read. I think I read it, but I might have heard it. It was a long time ago from William Gibson, the guy who wrote Neuromancer and Mona Lisa Overdrive and some other early cyberpunk books, that he was one of the few that defined the cyberpunk genre early on. And this is how he described the general structure of his stories, where we start out on the left with characters and groups that have their own goals, and they're proceeding along the way. And on the way, they can't see it, but the reader can, because the reader, it isn't an omniscient storytelling, but it's kind of semi-omniscient. The reader is seeing all of these groups and characters and their goals, and the reader starts to realize that these are going to collide. The characters don't. The characters don't know this is going to happen. The reader can, or the viewer can in the case of a visual presentation. And this creates tension, because you know it's coming, but you don't know exactly when, and you don't know what's going to happen. It's Hitchcock made a metaphor, so he really was talking kind of in the same vein, but he wasn't quite about a collision. But he was making a metaphor about a restaurant scene. And you have a social scene. It's not a high intensity action scene. It is a social scene. It is a bunch of characters in a restaurant having lunch. And you maybe know some of them, but it's not just one table. It's a whole bunch of people at different tables in the restaurant having lunch, and you know some of them and care about them. Some of them are people you're just meeting for the first time. And it's just the social event of lunch in the restaurant. And that's not a bad scene. It's a scene that is character building. It's exposition, that you're getting characters telling you things that you're going to need to know later. It has its place. And then he said, now tell the same story. But before everything starts, you show a picture of a bomb under one of the tables. And now it's the exact same thing. Exact same characters having the exact same discussions, but you don't know which table the bomb is under, and you don't know when it's going off. And all of a sudden, it's a whole different scene. Because now, every time a character is talking, you're wondering, what does this have to do with the bomb? Is this the person who's the target of the bomb? Is what they're talking about the reason why someone would want to bomb them? Or are they an innocent victim just caught up in all of this? So by adding in this near omniscient view that you know the disaster is coming, you have a tension that wasn't there in the scene before. And eventually the collision happens. The collision happens, and now it's usually violent or bloody or tension filled or emotion filled, but it is something happens now. And now you are in a different world. And coming off from that collision, your characters, if you look at the coloration on the dots here, different characters are now grouped up with other characters. Different characters are on different courses. People have taken different paths because the collision changed everything. So again, Gibson did this almost literally collisions. It was violent fights where he would I want to say it was Mona Lisa Overdrive where I really noticed it. Might have been the other one. I forget what his third one was. But he does this where you are watching all these characters, all of whom are trying to scratch out a living in a crime-filled future dystopia where you just are trying to survive and maybe trying to cling to a sense of morality. But for most of you, survival itself is the only morality you can afford. And they're all coming together, and you as the reader are seeing that they all want the same things. And they can't all have the same things. And you're watching the progression and realizing they're all going to come at the goal at the same time. And coming off that, literally, one of the characters who was a solid loner comes out of that. They don't have what they were looking for, but they now have allies they would not have chosen for other reasons. But now they are part of a new group that is going to have a new plan to pursue their goals. So there's one classic example of this, and I really think that this kind of describes all three of his early cyberpunk books. Another example, I'm not ashamed to toot my own horn, this is A Fine and Dangerous Season, the story that I wrote 2 years ago for FireCon's Firetober set prompt session. Hi, Jenna. Hi, Don Ray. Where the stories started out as short stories in response to prompts, and I started to realize that they were all in a shared universe with a bunch of writers and an editor and a mathematician, all really involved in the same story, but they can't see it because they are each having their own world, their own goals. They aren't running into each other, except they almost are. Because a central location in the story is Myra's Donut Galaxy, a donut shop run by a local science fiction fan, where they're all customers of this, and there is one stretch of 3 or 4 chapters of the same characters all visiting the donut shop at the same time. But they don't know who each other are, and so therefore they don't realize that they're all coming together in their story. And the reader is, I hope, spoiler alert, the reader is saying, is this it? Is this where they run into each other? Well, I'm the author, so I let them run into each other, but not. I'm not ready for them to actually come together yet. So they're running into each other, not knowing who each other are, and that just causes more chaos and confusion. Until eventually, later, they all come together at a point where now they're forced to deal with each other, and they come out of this as a fused unit with a common set of goals, but also with their fears and their concerns and their challenges. I pretty much followed the Collider model on that. I can't say I did it consciously because there was no conscious planning in this book at all. But it was semi-consciously, when I started realizing that I was following these characters back and forth, I started to say, I'll bet there's a collision coming. I just have to find where it is. Collisions might be combined with fortune graphs. They might happen at some point, generally in the failing section of a fortune graph. Part of the failure might be a collision. They might be combined with a beat sheet that you might have One of your cards, one of your scenes in the beat sheet is a collision as a as a result of things that came before. So we've got all these different cards where things are happening, but they are all implicitly leading up to a collision. So I might have one whole act, which is the collision, which is now that we've had the false victory and everybody thinks they know what they're doing, we start to see them all coming together, and we as the audience can see that bad things are coming, but they can't see it. So that's collision model. And again, collision model with our cards.
This is an onion. It's a metaphor for a news story. Only a few hours ago, I was standing on a ledge, 60 stories above the street, interviewing a man who subsequently jumped to his death. $40 million in the bank, happily married, good health. Great story. But there's got to be more. I mean, we're pros, right? Some kind of extramarital hanky-panky, maybe? Another great story. Maybe the guy's been accused of child molesting. Ah, terrific story. What? Turns out the accusations were false? Wonderful. More story. Maybe the alleged mistress was lying, setting the guy up, huh? Sensational story. So we keep going. Oh, excuse me. Keep digging, keep investigating. We expose the guy's whole life, his family. Why? Because we're pros. Because we're looking for the truth. What if it turns out, after all our digging, after all our painstaking investigation, what if it turns out there wasn't any truth? Just stories. One story after another, layer after layer, until there's nothing left.
All right. So that's a clip from one of my favorite movies that seems to almost be forgotten. I hardly ever hear anybody talk about Hero. Hero is a wonderful film, and this is the scene where Geena Davis, as the reporter, is getting an award for work in a field where she's starting to feel like it is a disreputable field, that they are really just a bunch of vultures feeding off of corpses. But it's also a good introduction to the onion model. Except if you're going to use the onion model, there has to be a real core to your onion. There has to be something there that everything else is hiding. So the classics talk about a riddle wrapped in a mystery, wrapped in an enigma. Inside of the riddle needs to be a truth, or why am I sitting through this story? It's very common for mysteries. It doesn't have to be a mystery story, but it sort of is implicitly a mystery, even if not a crime-solving mystery, because every level of revelation, every layer you peel off the onion leads to more questions. And if you just let the questions go, you're once again Sam saying, if we let it go now, nobody will tell the story. If you just let it go, you're done. But if you dig deeper, you ask those questions, you get more revelations. And at the center, you get a truth, a final truth that was being hidden by all the other layers, and maybe, depending on the story you're telling, maybe a final resolution. But I'm going to tell you that one of the classic onion stories, what's revealed in that final truth, does not get a final revelation. It, in fact, well, it does, but it is not a happy revelation. This is an onion model for Chinatown. I'm going to spoil the heck out of it. Sorry, but you're here to learn. You're not here to keep away from spoilers. If you haven't seen Chinatown, it is about Gittes, the detective, hired to investigate some simple thing, and he's a bulldog and he won't let go no matter how bad things get, and they get tragically bad. Or really, because onions are just layers hiding things, they always were tragically bad, but he does not make everything better in the end. Ultimately, he only shows how bad it is. So we start out with a woman named Evelyn hiring Gittes to follow her husband, Mulray. Mulray is spotted with a young woman. So Gittes has said, okay, here's what's going on. Here's what's really going on with the husband. But then Evelyn Mulray comes to visit him, and she's not the woman who came and asked him to investigate in the first place. And she's threatening him, stay out of our business. And Geddes is a bulldog. He doesn't let go. Soon after that, Mulray himself is drowned. So everything should be over. The unfaithful husband is out of the picture. Who cares anymore? But Geddes won't quite let it go. He's still investigating, and he finds out that Mulray used to be the business partner with Cross. Cross is a very, very wealthy developer in the area, and they were part of this Northwest Valley plan, which recently changed ownership. And Geddes discovers this is all an elaborate plot to line their pockets and take control of an area. And as he's trying to do this and investigate further, he finds that the real Evelyn is protecting Catherine, who was the woman who hired him in the first place. And then a woman named Ida Sessions is murdered. And Geddes is like, okay, this is getting bad. People are trying to hide this. And they learn that Mulray drowned in salt water. And the property has a saltwater koi pond. And so he was killed there. And as he's investigating that, he ultimately confronts the real Evelyn, who he discovers is the mother of the real Catherine. And they are the descendants of Cross. And Evelyn is the daughter he raped. And Catherine is the granddaughter that came from him raping Evelyn. And he murdered Mulray because he wanted all the money from this deal. And as Geddes has got this all put together, and Evelyn is trying to flee because she's just done with this. She's getting out of here. It can't be changed because this is just the way it is. And she's trying to flee, and the police, under Cross's orders, are trying to arrest her. As she tries to flee, she's a danger, and they shoot and kill her. Because forget it, Jake, it's Chinatown. It is a really sad and depressing film, but an excellent example of an onion model. That every layer he peels away, it just gets worse. And because he won't let go, he has to go through all of the worst, and there's nothing he can do to stop the ending. Okay, so that's a powerful one. I think onion diagrams, drawing them, I could have just listed those points. I didn't need to draw the actual target shape, the actual onion. But sometimes I see some benefit just a little bit in the diagram because I break it up into arcs. So we have secrets, we have clues to secrets, but clues can also lead to false leads, and we have adversaries. So now as you put things onto the onion, you can categorize what role they play in the story, and you might even plan a path through them. So here we start out with one with a secret. That brings us to the attention of an adversary. And the adversary throws us into a false lead, but on the false lead we get a clue. So there's number 4, come to number 5. That puts us smack in confrontation with the adversary again. And now we find the adversary's secret, which gets us to another clue, which leads us to another secret, and so on. That you can sort of see a path through this by categorizing and following the numbered steps. We can have a picture of how the story is progressing in different sorts of scenes and confrontations. Next, I want to talk about one of my favorite kinds of stories, a frame story, which can be visualized. I mean, not that you would actually draw this, but you can conceptually think of it as the iceberg. Because what's the classic thing we learned about icebergs back in elementary school? That what's above the water that you can see is only 10% or less of what's underneath. So the present, you have characters and situations and consequences. But in the past, you have mysteries, secrets, history, choices, conflicts, discoveries, losses, all of these things that shaped the present. And so the concept of a frame story is a story told in stories that might be flashbacks, might be anecdotes or parables. And besides the iceberg picture that, again, I don't think you draw, you might conceivably model this as, up in the upper right here, a fortune diagram where you call out to other diagrams. That for this part of the story, we're going back and telling this thing that happened in the past. And so your top diagram is made up of all of these inset things. So you understand what's happening now through the stories that happened elsewhere, elsewhen. And some classic examples, 1001 Nights, Scheherazade and the Sultan, who she keeps him from killing her every night by finishing a story on a cliffhanger and finishing it the next night and starting to another cliffhanger. That's a frame story. It's a very loose frame story because the stories have nothing to do with the present. Canterbury Tales, similarly, the stories more or less stand on their own. The present is about a bunch of pilgrims on their way on a pilgrimage, which is the one situation in that time and culture where you would bring together people from every social class as more or less equals. And while they're on the road, they're telling their stories. Citizen Kane is a tighter frame story. It is, hey, Charles Foster Kane is dead, and no one understands the man, so we're going to go back and tell stories of how it became this way. How I Met Your Mother is my all-time favorite frame story by far. And of course, my story, The Last Dance, can be considered somewhat of Citizen Kane in space. Very consciously told as a frame story. A similar concept is the history. The history is that you have sort of a big concept story, but you tell it in terms of things across time and space, showing how the present is the sum of the past. It's kind of a frame story without necessarily the frame. You're not telling the top line. You are telling the individual pieces underneath and implying the top line. And Mishner was famous for this. I don't know if people even read Mishner much today, but when I was a kid, he was all the rage because a bunch of his stuff were being adapted for movies and miniseries. And he did lots of these where he'd tell the story of a region. The one that I actually made it through because it's huge. Mishner, there's a term of art in the business they will call a goat gagger, a story that if a goat tried to eat it, they'd gag on that much paper. Mishner was the granddaddy of goat gaggers. And so I didn't get through many of them, but I got through Centennial. And Centennial has a loose frame story, a very loose frame story. The concept is a researcher who's looking for a project. He gets approached by somebody who has written a history of the mythical town of Centennial, Colorado. And yes, it was mythical then. There is a Centennial today. They named that well after the book and the miniseries came out. It is not the same place where Mishner told his story, but they may have taken the name from it. I don't know. But Centennial is really based on another Colorado town, but he changed the name so that he could, first of all, make up the history as he needed for his story purposes, and second, not get sued. But this researcher gets hired by a company that is publishing somebody's history of Centennial, and all they want this professor, who is a professional historian and researcher, all they really want him to do is fact check it. They just want him to go through and make sure that what's in this series of articles they're going to present actually really happened. And the rest of the book is the stories that the professor finds. And it's telling the history of Centennial. And it is a thorough history. It goes back literally to before the earth formed, and proceeds to walk through the earth forming, coalescing from all the different debris and cooling down, and eventually life starting to populate the planet. And it goes through a period of the dinosaurs taking over the area And it goes through past that the mammals taking over and the mastodons, and eventually the arrival of the bison, and eventually the Native Americans who hunt and live on the bison, leading to the European settlers arriving, and so on and so on and so on. He literally started with the creation of this. And when I was reading it at the first time, it's like, really? Really? Do we really need to see that? Yes. Because everything that happened in those historical tales eventually becomes part of the present where the researcher is. That the dinosaurs, that area out there is famous for fossil finds. The bison were a huge part of the local culture. And as they started to die out, it changed the local culture, and so on and so on. Every one of these things was necessary so that when we hit the ending, I understood Centennial. I understood everything about this fictional city, which again was based kind of on a real city. I would never do this to that degree, but I was impressed how thoroughly he brought all of these pieces together so that suddenly now you understand the modern residents of Centennial and everything about their past and how they got here, everything about it. He pulled it together. So that's the example of a history. And my last one, I'm going to talk about world lining. I'm going to tell you right now, I would never draw a world line. Now we are into mental pictures. We are not into physical pictures. It's a way of thinking about a story and how the story evolves. And it starts with the concept from physics we call a world line. And the world line is essentially the destiny of a particle in space and time. That at some time zero, you know where that particle was and how fast it was moving and what was going on around it. And so you know, unless you are in a advanced science fiction or a fantasy story, you know nothing can go faster than the speed of light. So you know that that world line for that particle is constrained. And that's represented here by the line going forward, which is your time axis, and the vertical and horizontal, the upper and lower diagonal lines. Those are saying this is as far as this particle can possibly move up or down. It cannot move any farther. To go farther than that would be to break the speed of light, which we're not allowing in this universe. So the two light gray sections of this are places that that particle will never be at that point in time. It might be there at some future point, but at that point in time, it cannot be in those gray areas. And one day I was thinking about one of my stories, and I was thinking about where my character starts precludes certain things from ever happening. Other things might happen, but it depends on what happens next. So my character starting at point time zero, there's a universe of things that could happen, and there are universes of things that can't. And now I write some story. So now at some point, now we know where the character was and what was happening at a certain point in the story. And now we have new no-go zones. We now know that, again, anything within the gray cannot happen unless I go back and change what I've written. Those things are not possible. Or unless I go back, in following Dean's example, in the cycling example, I go back and retroactively create the conditions to let them happen. So these are things that cannot happen. And then we write some more. And now we have a new point of where the character was at this time and what was happening in their life at this time. And so I know things that cannot happen. And I am, as you've heard before, I'm a pantser. I don't really know where the story is going, but I'm building up my picture in my head as I go along of places it can't go. Places it cannot go because of the decisions, the decisions I've already made. unless I want to go back and reverse some of those decisions. There are things that can't happen. And at some point, I may start to figure out an aim point that I start to think, I know how I want this to end. And now every time I take a step, I ask myself, can I still get to the aim point? If not, I need to change that. So I'm planning as I go. So here is an example of a world line for Superman. Virtually all versions of Superman, there have been many versions, but virtually all versions start with Krypton exploding. So what that tells you is there are two things we are never going to see. One is he's never going to have his happy family on Krypton because there ain't no more Krypton anymore. And he's not going to be a movie star on Krypton. Now, showing that sometimes comics, when you have to keep telling stories for 80 years, have to sometimes stretch the boundaries. Both of those are stories that were actually written at one point or another. The Happy Family on Krypton was an imaginary story. Somebody gave him a device which gave him his wildest dreams and made him completely paralyzed because he was living in this fantasy world. And the movie star on Krypton was actually a time travel story. He got sent back in time. He ended up on Krypton before his own birth and became a movie star before he ended up getting tumbled back into his present. And so he did actually have a movie star. But you wouldn't think that he's ever going to be a movie star on Krypton after Krypton explodes. They had to kind of work around those rules. And then he's found by the Kents, which means we know two stories that aren't going to happen. But DC sometimes writes what they call Elseworld stories, DC being the publisher. Elseworlds are what would have happened if. And there is a story called Red Sun where the infant Kal-El was found by the Soviets in the plains of Russia and raised as the ultimate Soviet Superman. That story can't happen in the world where he was found by the Kents. There's also a much older Elseworld story. Back then, they didn't call them Elseworlds. They called them imaginary stories, to which some writers respond, you mean they're not all imaginary? But there was an imaginary story where Superman, where the young Kal-El was found by Lex Luthor's father, and he was raised as Luthor's stepbrother. Well, we know that story's not going to happen once he's been found by the Kents. And eventually he joins the Daily Planet. So we know he's not going to be a football star, and he's probably not going to be a Prince of Atlantis. Again, things that might have happened if the story had gone differently. So every time we take a step in the larger story, we are eliminating things that could happen. And that's the concept of world lining. And again, I'm not going to draw these, but I will think these sometimes as I'm thinking, no, that can't happen with what I know now. So either what I know now is wrong, or I'm going to take that story somewhere else. Okay. So I've shown you 4 weeks of modeling, and now you want to know, where do you start? And here we're getting into tools, not rules. If I were to give you a formal method, rules, I would tell you exactly where to start. And I kind of teach these in a formal method because I need a structure to teach inside. But that's not where you have to start. The informal method just gives you suggestions of places. But remember what we talked about with our dwarves in the woods, with the concept of shu-ha-ri, with mastery. With mastery, you are at the re level. The shu level is you are protecting, you are obeying the rules because you have to learn. At the ha level, you know how to break the rules productively. And at the re level, the leave or transcend, there are no rules. There are only tools. There are only situations where you apply what you know. So mastery, there are 3 things you might choose to decide where you're going to start modeling. One is model the things you know. I talked about early on the concept of the outline effect. By creating models of what you know already, you are stopping and thinking about what you know and maybe learning some other stuff. Or you might start with what you don't know, because you already know what you know. And yeah, that sounds redundant, but it's important. You already know what you know, so ask yourself what you don't know and start drawing those pictures. Or, and this is me these days, because I am a pantser. I am improvising as I go along. I start drawing a model when I feel blocked and I have a question and I don't understand it and it is too complicated to be answered while driving down the road to work. I need to sit down and understand it, so I will draw models from there. We talked a little about this in our initial session, throwing it all away. And this is when I came to fall in love with the beat sheet, with Save the Cat, because we reached a point where it really did feel formulaic. And then Snyder says, it's a trick he plays on himself. It's an exercise in storing moments, rhythms, scenes, and scene sequences. It's scouting. It is thinking about the problem, but then he can throw it all away when he starts writing. He has the freedom to just do what he wants. And suddenly I got it. I've done a lot of software modeling, both for my regular job and also when I was consulting. And I had one time where I've been teaching courses on software modeling, and a bunch of my students said, hey, we think this is important. We think we need to do this in our job. Our manager and our employer do not see the benefit for it. Could you help us show them? Could you model with us to help us show them the benefit? And I'm like, well, you're all good students. I really appreciate this. I'm honored. Sure. So tell me what you do again. Oh, we make the software to manage studies of brain tests and diagnostics for researchers. It's like, oh my word, they're literally doing brain science. I don't know brain science. But as you may have noticed, I love a challenge. So I'm like, and a challenge they're going to pay for. So I'm like, sure, I can do that. Send me everything you have that I would need to know to understand what you do. There's no way I can possibly know all of this yet, but send me everything you have, and then let's get together on such and such a calendar date. I will come out and we will start doing this work. And they sent me all sorts of journals and documents and all sorts of stuff. And I started making models. And this was my way to explore their world by using that outline effect to create pictures of what they were telling me. By creating pictures, I am learning, I am studying, I am connecting, I am building a vocabulary, I am building an understanding. I am really getting to understand how these research experiments and studies on brain science are working. I am really getting this together. And when we met with them, I said, okay, here's what I've done. And I threw it away. Right in front of their eyes, I threw it away. Because I knew that what I did was wrong. There's no way in 3 weeks I could be right. All I was doing was scouting their territory. So I had the vocabulary, I had the concepts, I had the roles. And now I said, now let's together, you folks and me, let's together go and build a model of this now that I can speak your language. And we spent more than a week modeling their problem domain and having them teach me. And we were building a model that had some resemblance to what I built, but it was much more right because I had all of their brains involved. And when I put all that together, we reached a point where I said, okay, now you've told me what you know, but you're not the researchers. The researchers have to be able to use this tool. So we need them to educate us further. So we need to have meetings with them, one-on-one meetings with them. And I love this. There's a tragic ending to this story, but I love this. I really love this, the way it played out. Because researchers are busy people and programmers are an annoyance that are in the way. Programmers, why can't they just give me what I need? Because you haven't told them. But you don't say that because that would be impolite. Why can't you just give us what we need? So we got some of the key people, and what happened was we would schedule 2 per day, and each of them agreed reluctantly they would give us a half hour. And not a one of them gave us less than 3 hours because of how this played out. I would show them the picture of what we had learned in their area of the domain, and we'd be maybe 5 or 10 minutes in, and they would tell us where we were wrong. I never taught them how to read the diagrams. I just am good at drawing diagrams. So they could read them without me having to teach them how. They could see what was wrong, and they would tell me what was wrong, and I would fix it. And it was less wrong. And over the course of the next 3 hours, they would start to see that I was drawing a picture of what they knew with their help. And this went on with expert after expert for a solid week. And by the end of that, we had a wonderfully detailed picture of the process. We took it and presented it to the whole team. And at the end, they were practically applauding because we had done such a good job of both describing what they did for a living. And experts love it when people actually hear them and understand them, and showing how the software could fit in this. I considered it an absolute wonderful success, except for one small problem. The prime researcher was out of town for the entire 3 weeks, and when he came back, he didn't even look at the pictures. He just said, wow, this is a waste of time. And they dumped it. Had he been there, I'd have won him over, because we won everybody over. But part of the way it worked was the willingness to throw it all away when it comes time to do the real work. Now, you don't throw it all away. You throw it aside, because if you ever really need to go back and look at it, it might tell you things you missed. So it's good to have it there, but you're now doing the real work. And Snyder, when he reached the point where he said, just throw it away. Now you've scouted things out. Now you can write the screenplay. That is liberating. Then all the people who say, this is so formulaic, it's like, no, it's a way of structuring what I've learned. And now I will tell my story. All right. We talked about this earlier. I want to talk again about my toolkit, what I use to do my modeling, that I don't say you should have to use this, because it adds up to money all the way around. Enterprise Architect is a UML software modeling tool that the last time I priced it was $229, but I need it for my day job, so it was worth it. Excel and PowerPoint, $149 was the last time I priced that out. Again, I needed it for my day job. PaintShop Pro is a pretty good drawing tool for 80 bucks. Makes it cheaper than Photoshop. I consider it to be pretty much useful until I have to share with other people, but I generally don't. And I have been using it since like 2005, so I'm really familiar with it. Campaign Cartographer is how I draw my maps. It's a $22 mapping tool, and I love maps, so I'm happy that I paid that $22 more than 10 years ago. I wouldn't have remembered what that $22 was, but I still use Campaign Cartographer all the time. I also use Windows Journal, which is free with Windows, but only if you can find it, because they keep removing it and I have to keep reinstalling it. It's a security risk if you do certain things with it, which I never do. Some other tools, and we talked about these, Miro, Canva, Trello, are all collaboration work tools that let you create shapes and drag them around. Visio and PowerPoint also let you do that. But there's always the old reliable manual methods, your pencils, your papers, your Post-its, your dry erase markers, your whiteboards, and so on. You aren't trying to produce publishable pictures. You're trying to think about things. So low-tech is perfectly fine as long as you can still read things in it. And that will basically bring us to the end of story models. Any questions at this point? No one has questions? All right, let's talk about our upcoming schedule. Next week is going to be another tribute session. tribute to Rebecca and Kevin, two of my favorite mentors. And you may know them from their fiction. You may know them from Superstars. You may know them from lots of places. Then we'll be talking about free fall and spin gravity. We'll be talking marketing for introverts. We'll be talking about improv on the 2nd. We'll be talking about openings, beginnings on the 9th. We'll be talking about story strategies based on a FireCon presentation that I did a few years back on the 16th. Orbits and transfers on the 23rd. The 30th, I'm going to be doing a tribute to Jack McDevitt. That's going to be tricky, but also lots of fun. Jack has not written a lot of writing articles or writing books, but he's given lots of advice in his blog through the years. So I'm skimming through his blog, looking for writing lessons, and also re-listening to a bunch of his books for lessons I've drawn from them. On the 7th, I'll be talking about copyright, and on the 14th on voice. So again, paying for the soup. Take a look at Today I Remember. And we wrap up with any questions, and we can now stop our share. All right. And we did have some comments in the chat. Yes, Dawn Ray called out. One of the novels currently working on is absolutely, that was Collider model, right, Jenna?
Yes, Collider.
Okay. And Dawn Ray mentioned The Usual Suspects. I have not seen it, but it sounds like a complex caper sort of thing, which can often be a collider. And Sherry had to let us go. So it looks like I'm left with the two of you. So hopefully helpful. And hopefully did good justice to the topic. So I will be letting people go, and I will be seeing you all in a week. And of course, perhaps seeing you online sooner than that. Amen.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you. And our recording